Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. We are a post-evangelical podcast of ministers and theological thinkers grappling with our place in the progressive Christian world. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on faith and culture. This is the last Tuesday of the month, which means it is time for me to be joined by my secondary co-hosts, Adam and Dylan, for another edition of Divine SINema. This is where we take a break from our regular programming. Alan and Mona take the week off, and Adam and Dylan join me for a discussion on a Christian movie. Most of them will be bad. Our unofficial tagline is watching bad Christian movies so that you don't have to. And this week, we have a good one. This one is called If Footmen Tire You, What Will Horses Do? And it's from 1971. And as far as I can tell, it is the first end times movie that would later be followed by such classics as Thief in the Night and, of course, Left Behind. So just real quick, if you're listening here, this is going to be a new kind of tradition for us at the end of every month. And if you want to watch this film, you don't need to buy it. You don't need to go on Netflix. You don't need to go anywhere. It's actually on YouTube. So if you check the show notes at irenicast.com/91, there'll be a link and you can watch this movie. It's about 45 minutes long. So if you want to go do that, pause this, come back to it. Otherwise, you can just listen to us talk about it. But I will give you a warning. It is really graphic. It is not something you want to watch with kids or anyone who is not a fan of horror films, and we'll get into that as we go in the conversation. So here's a little sample of the movie we're about to talk about.
What's the matter, little boy?
Where's my mama and my daddy? You've killed them, haven't you?
Yes. Think of how much better off you will be. The state will provide for you and take care of your every need. Much better than your mother or father either.
I won't go state. I want my mama and my daddy.
Now you listen to me, little boy. What is done is done. You now belong to the state. Now you listen very carefully to what I have to say. We do not want to kill you, but we will. Unless you cooperate. Now if you will step on this picture of your Jesus with your heels, they will let you go free. But if you don't, they will cut your head off.
One day you died for me. Now I'm willing to die for you.
Why, you stupid little fool! Christianity is stupid. Christianity is stupid. Christianity is stupid. Communism is good. Communism is good. Communism is good. Communism is good. Give up. Did you hear that? Give up.
You find this shocking? There are things more shocking to come.
All right. This is going to be fun. So a little bit of background. This was in 1971. And the director of this film, his name is Ron Ormond. And he's actually kind of a pretty well-known name in the exploitation film genre that kind of sprung out in the 50s and 60s and then onward. And exploitation films are essentially films that push the boundaries of things that other films aren't willing to show or put on camera and take advantage of and exploit modern trends. So they're the type of film that are very much playing on the culture that they exist in. So in a lot of ways, they're very, they're good for film history because you're getting a glimpse of the culture in which it was around it. And the director of this particular film, his name is Ron Ormond. He did films, a couple of them, one of them called The Exotic Ones, or AKA The Monster and the Stripper. And then he also did another one called Untamed Mistress in 1956. And so these are the type of films that this man was doing. And he had this plane ride with his wife and his son. And they basically woke up out of an unconscious state, and the whole plane was torn apart, and they were the only ones that had survived the incident, and then had another plane incident shortly after that, which caused them to question, why did I survive? And eventually,
why we go back on a plane after the first time.
Exactly. And eventually converted to Christianity and was approached by someone who knew the pastor, who kind of was the mind behind this film, Estus Washington Pirkle. And that's how this union of filmmaker and pastor came together to make these films. And there's a couple others actually that they did together. There's a sequel called The Burning Hell, and then the other one called The Believer's Heaven. I think those are on YouTube as well. We'll try to put those in the show notes if they are. So all that to say, the premise of this movie is essentially it is a sermon, and the man in the film itself is Pastor Estus Washington Pirkle, and he gives an end time sermon. And about a couple minutes into the sermon, a lady comes in late. It cuts to her and her boyfriend, or the man that she's with, and she needs to keep up appearances. So she goes into church. She comes into the sermon late. And throughout the whole sermon, it cuts back to her, and she starts thinking about the message that Jesus is coming back soon and the communists are taking over. And it's interspersed between these hypothetical scenarios of what will happen if Christianity does not regain a foothold in American culture because the communists will take over. Eventually, it starts going to flashbacks for the woman, Judy, and you begin to learn that she had a relationship with her mom, and her mom had passed and wanted her to accept Jesus. And at the end, in the most climactic scene, when a young child's head is cut off and thrown down a driveway in the church parking lot, she screams out. And then, spoilers, this is the big reveal at the end. She wasn't in a church service. She was at her mother's funeral and came down to the altar and accepted Jesus into her heart because Mr. or Reverend Pirkle scared her into it. So that a fairly accurate assessment of, I guess the plot is difficult because this is kind of it's really based off a sermon. Did I miss anything?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, I was a little confused at the end because her mom kind of like disappeared, or the casket disappeared. Do you guys remember that?
I think it was trying to go for like an effect of her watching over the funeral.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Or like a flashback. I'm not sure. It was a little bit confusing the way that they filmed it. But the impression that I got was that was the reveal, like the sixth sense moment where she's like, oh, she was dead the whole time, but not her, but it was her mom.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, the time play is especially confusing. It's confusing because they use the same technique for like flashbacks as well as for like kind of like a flash forward. This is what could happen, and this is what has happened. So it's kind of confusing to know where you're at in the timeline.
Yeah, because the whole movie takes place in a church, and then the first half of the sermon is all the horrible things that the communists will do if they take over, and then the second half is here's how you need to respond personally to this and change your life, and that's where we kind of get the flashbacks. But yeah, it takes a lot of liberty in the things that it wants to put out there. So what caught your attention the most in this film?
Yeah, where do we go?
Oh, man.
On the internet, when you search for it, I don't know if it's Wikipedia or whatever, but like the little short answer thing that pops up on Google says propaganda film. And that seems very clear. I remember watching one of the very first propaganda films created, the Battleship Potemkin. And it just had a very similar feel of like the pace, lots of movement in the flashbacks or the flash forwards or whatever. But just clearly, this was an anti-communist movie. That seemed to be the main point. And it felt like that really overshadowed in many ways any kind of like religious relevance. And I think that would be true of the time anyway, of like, I think most people that this film would be reaching were part of like the audience itself would be people who kind of saw themselves, especially like America, as this Christian nation.
I was going to say, it felt like kind of like a fever dream for most of it. And that mixed with, have you guys, I'm not trying to put down people with mental illnesses or anything, but have you ever interacted with somebody who's not quite all there mentally, or is just kind of like operating on a different plane? It felt a lot like a movie version of that. And if that's what they were going for, then I think they succeeded, because it was just operating under very different, I think, circumstances than most people.
Yeah, and it went out of its way to like really try to legitimize the things that it was taken. Like he mentioned several times, like the wording was, here's another documented account of what happened in another country.
Absolutely.
And then gave very like specific numbers, like this many million people. And if the communists take over, like 67 million Christians will die. And it was like very like the way he described things was so specific. It was, I wonder where he was getting all the information from. Like even to like at one scene, they were talking about how people were standing against the wall, and he's like, and their noses will be 7 inches from the wall, and you're like, why?
Yeah.
So why that many inches? Like it was very strange.
He's a detail-oriented man.
Yes,
I felt the gap of culture. I mean, clearly, right? Like this was 40 years ago, more, and just the sense of how different our cultural experience. I mean, it really felt like kind of like the last vestiges of the 1950s of what Christianity is, what the family's supposed to look like. And it's starting to be attacked by the different movements that have been going on. And so it's this, it felt a little bit like watching an old episode of Leave It to Beaver or something, where it's like, oh, like those jokes don't land anymore, or those like, just because the context is so different, to where I felt like, my kind of postmodern mindset is just not going to hold on. Can't take this seriously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I was watching it, I maybe that's just because we're in the midst, or we're at the end of a pretty exhausting election cycle, but I felt like the rhetoric was very familiar. It was very current in the way that he was talking, like the fear rhetoric that he was using about riots and police being killed, and all the rhetoric that we see from the right in a lot of ways. And if you just replace communism with the word terrorism, it was a lot like some of the speeches that we heard during this election season. And even like the strange young people that are coming into our church, like that's the word that he used. And you replace that with the millennials and what we're hearing today. I was surprised with how current it felt with that part. But then the other side of it, like what you were talking about, Adam, it was also so removed from the way that the world really is, which is kind of seems to be so far in the movies that we've looked at a common thread.
Yeah. And I think that's true. Like the frustration that we had with our current political season is that you go, how can anybody be buying this? How can anybody, for me is like, no one really thinks like this, right? But I think you're right. There is this complete, like you could substitute a few words and be like, oh, this is very familiar, but you can see right through it, right? This is silly. There's nobody. Like, so at one point he makes a comment about how it took communism 6 days, I think, to overtake, like to basically conquer China, and they're figuring out ways they're gonna. In the U.S., it'll only take 15 minutes. Which is just like, come on, no one's taking this guy seriously. But on the flip side, I do want to say, like, I mean, communism was a serious thing, right? And I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been compelled by some of these arguments that are being made, like the kind of fear. The way that people would have definitely responded to that in some ways then does match up to like today's, our political scene as well, where it's like, oh man, are people really this fearful or this, afraid of what's going to happen? So I guess, I mean, that's kind of like, it had the same effect of like, wow, I really feel distance from this whole world and universe where it seems like this is believable. And I know at the time the movie was probably a push to like a little bit further, a little more extreme than what people were used to seeing. I
don't know. I think it was pretty, I mean, this is coming at the tail end of the MacArthur and the Red Scare and people being blacklisted, especially in Hollywood and films. So this is kind of matching probably the tail end of that hysteric, but certainly matches its tone in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think I agree with the what you said, Jeff, about how it mirrored some of the fear mongering that has gone on in this last political season. And for me, that was a little reassuring that this isn't something that we've been seeing just in the current realm of politics, but it's been going on for quite a while. Reassuring in one sense, but also, disappointed and sad in another sense.
For sure.
That's how people use to get people on their side against different ideologies or things like that.
Mm-hmm. I have the same effect when I read a book from like, that just seems to really speak to the current, spiritual climate or something like that. And then I find out, it was written like in the early 80s or the 60s or something. I go, really? We've had this around for this long and we still haven't figured this? Like, I mean, I guess I'm just finding stuff like that. But man, yeah, it is both disconcerting and like, well, I guess in some ways things have kind of been like this. So we shouldn't be overly surprised. We're like, oh man. I don't know, maybe that speaks to a certain like progressive bias of thinking like we're further than we really are, or trying to see future, see the future, or see like, a hopeful vision, which leads to possibly like overlooking and missing the fact that, oh man, so many people, whether or not I agree with them where they land, are though experiencing difficulty or like right now, right? I mean, half the country seems to think it's worth it to take this kind of, gamble. So there's this disconnect between their experience and my own experience that, gets just highlighted and brought to the forefront.
What about any particular scenes stand out to you? I mean, there's so many to choose from.
Okay, so a lot of the horror is, maybe at the time, like, wow, look at the kind of effects, so it's a little campy from our current time. But there were a few scenes where I thought, just psychologically, this is hard to watch. I mean, like, as much as I know, like, okay, that's clearly fake, or the blood is just like spattered ketchup that looks like they threw it off a paintbrush onto them. Like, I've seen, I see The Walking Dead, and things are very graphic and clear. And so, I didn't, that part of it doesn't really affect me. But for instance, there was one scene where it was like, they're forcing the kids of this guy to like lower him onto pitchforks sticking out of the ground or whatever. And this guy's laughing the whole time. And it's totally silly on one standpoint, but at the same time, I was feeling like just kind of like gross inside. Like it was working. Like the different scenes like that. Some of the other ones I thought were just, oh, okay, that's dumb or that's silly, or people just falling over. But that one in particular, for some reason, because of how like contrived the torture aspect of it was, or how like just the whole scenario, I was like, this is really terrible. Like maybe, yeah. Like communism sucks. I totally bought into it pretty, that affected me quite a bit.
Yeah. I think a scene that stuck out to me was the schoolroom scene, and the
so brilliant.
The teacher's name.
Your Jesus didn't bring you any candy.
It's like, damn, that's a good argument. I can't compete with that.
Yeah, give us the outline of that scene. That was fantastic.
All right. So the teacher comes into the classroom who is, in full communist soldier garb, and the teacher's name is Comrade Teacher from the credits, which I think is wonderful. He asks all the kids if they believe in Jesus, and most of the little white children raise their hands and say, yeah. And then he essentially decides to put their Jesus to the test and see if Jesus can produce candy. And he's like, look, Jesus can't produce candy, all the while sounding like Jack Nicholson is having a stroke. And after he says, hey, look, Jesus can't produce candy, he says, you know who can produce candy? Our faithful leader, Fidel Castro. And then he proceeds to hand out candy to the kids.
That was my favorite scene in the whole movie. Like, it made me laugh. The line, like, it's still stuck in my head where it's like, I don't see any candy. I don't taste any candy. There is no candy. Your Jesus didn't bring us any candy. That's great. I want to get a t-shirt that says your Jesus didn't bring us any candy.
That's so fantastic.
I would wear that t-shirt.
I love how the masters of manipulation, because the communists are framed that way in the rhetoric of this film, are basically like using the very thing that is like almost the stereotype of what someone who's a manipulator would use. Like, they didn't even bother to write a scene that actually showed, real masterful manipulation. It was just, oh, it's kids' candy. Let's just go with that.
Yeah.
That scene, it does start with them saying, the pastor character saying, the real pastor guy saying something about like with, they will brainwash our kids with, cruelty and subtlety or something like that. Like it literally says subtlety. And I was like, okay, let's see how he goes. And it was pretty on the nose. Like, it's about the least subtle candy. And then it's like, the kids must be idiots, because it's not like the candy appears, right? He like knocks on the door and has his, fellow henchmen walk through with a bag that pours onto the like, see how Fidel Castro, when you pray to him.
Yeah, and then towards the end, he's like throwing up the candy, and he's like, glorious candy for everybody.
This is wonderful.
It was great. See, that scene I thought was entertaining. And going back to Adam, what you were talking about like being disturbed, pretty much my whole life, like horror films, I love them. I watch I've seen a lot of the old exploitation films from the around this era, the 80s, slasher films. So I've seen the goriest of the goriest and never had a problem. Enjoy them. Which I know the glaring hypocrisy of that, considering the fact that I'm a pacifist, but in this one, there's that scene where he's describing how they'll take the kids and he's got this sharpened bamboo.
Yeah.
Like, and forgive me, this is, if you haven't seen this movie and you can't deal with graphic stuff, don't go watch this. Cause this scene, like, even me, I was like, oh my gosh, all the violence seems to be, first of all, directed towards kids, or most of it does, which is very odd. And there seems to be like a gross, like, reveling in the violence of the film, which is really disturbing as well. But basically this communist / Nazi / every bad guy in film caricature of the communists comes over and takes a bamboo shoot and like shoves it in the ear of this child. Then they back out and they show the little thing sticking out of his ear. And then I'm pretty sure the kid is like legitimately throwing up. Because then I was just
it really does look like
really disturbing. And it was like jarring and just really, for me, highlighted the central hypocrisy of the entire film, which was, we are here to bring about goodness, but we're using the very like medium that, because the whole point of the exploitation film was to push the boundaries of contemporary morality and like put stuff out there that people weren't seeing, to kind of get people to open up a little bit and be a little bit more open with the way that they approach the world. And they're using this very medium that pushes those boundaries, and especially they're pushing the boundaries of violence. Obviously, they're not showing anyone who's nude, or they're not using any cussing, which, those are the boundaries we don't show in Christian films. But violence, graphic violence, we're fine with that. And it was that whole moment, I was like, man, that is the epitome of this film.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. There's a lot of contradictory messages of, look at there. I think there was one point where the pastor was talking about all the violence and things that they see in cartoons and TV, and to see that juxtaposed with poorly done images of gore. To see this juxtaposed was very, I think, confusing, and made me kind of unsure of what message they were trying to communicate with that.
Yeah, because it was in the midst of that tirade in his sermon about like all the different sins that people are approaching, the strange young people, the public school, the public school, when they cut to that scene where the guy is like talking about, because now the public schools, instead of teaching us the 3 R's, they're teaching us sexual education. And it goes to this guy who's about to show the class like the 7 erotic zones
of women.
And I'm thinking, man, that would have been a way better sex ed class.
That's right.
I was legitimately kind of disappointed when they cut away. I was like, okay.
Like, man, I could really use that.
None of us Googled. Wait, what are they? What are the 7? No, we didn't.
No, we didn't. But like, it was moments like that, and then they go on like the drive-in theater and all the den of iniquity that happens there, like all these places, and then dancing. I loved how his what was it? Dancing is like
just as wrong as it's always been.
Yeah, and the front door to adultery,
That's
what
right.
starts on the dance floor ends in the bedroom or something like that.
Yeah, the drive-in theater is a spawning house for sex.
There it is. Yeah, and it was like, have you ever been to a drive-in theater? Like, there was this clear like disconnect. Like, this is what we're assuming and telling people are happening at these places, which I'm sure it happens from time to time, but it's not like a den of it. It's not all over the place. And then when they talk about marriage, they talk about how these pastors are marrying people who've been married before. And again, that was another one of those moments where it was like marriage becoming the central focus. You take away people who've been married before and replace it with people from the LGBTQ community. Like, that whole marriage rhetoric still very much alive in certain areas. It was just, it was crazy, the things that they put out there.
Yeah. Another scene that I thought was particularly terrible. He was talking about a woman that got catcalled for wearing a skirt that was too short in church.
Yes. And then you're like, okay, so the church was bad. No, it was, yeah,
it was the woman's fault for wearing a skirt that was too short. It was absurd.
One of my favorite scenes is there's a group of people sitting in benches outside. It's kind of like a field, I'm guessing. It's kind of dark, so you don't really see the setting, but it's under this like, this is what's going to happen. if the communist comes, you'll be sitting in benches with no cushions or backs, which is like you're stabbing kids through the ear with a bamboo shoot. You're shooting people in the gut after they like accept Jesus, and you're mowing down people with machine guns,
taking away
and
their cushions.
Taking away the cushion. It's like, wait a second. I'm sure people are just like looking at their pews, like, wait a minute, this doesn't have any cushion. But then they're forced to repeat over and over, right? Communism is good. Christianity is stupid. Give up, give up, give up.
That would have been a much better ending, right? As if like that was the last rhetoric, and he starts saying they take away the cushions, and then everyone looks at their seats and there's no cushions, and then he ends up being the communist.
Oh goodness, that would have been
great.
An ending for the ages. Another thing I thought was super funny was that, I get it that there's horses in the title, but there's like horses throughout the film, and it's in the title. I get it. I understand. But from a militaristic standpoint, that makes exactly zero sense.
Yeah. Especially within the context of the 70s. I don't think they were still... I get they were trying to, go with the whole... Because the whole thing, you may hear the title and you're like, well, what's that? Well, it's based off of scripture in Jeremiah 12:5, which says, if you have run with footmen and they have tired you out, then how can you compete with horses? Mm-hmm. If you fall down in the land of peace, how will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? So it's like, the undergoing analogy is you think it's bad now, wait till whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, but they definitely exhausted the whole... In fact, I only think they used the vehicle once when they were shipping away the kids in the back of the pickup truck, right?
It was Ford too, American made.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Russia, or I guess Cuba, or whoever, China, any of them. At least they're using our vehicles.
It's true. Well, they took us over. They might as well.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, I just want to say one of my favorite things that he said. Okay, at the very beginning, and this is just like a little Easter egg, the guy who plays the boyfriend of Judy, so she gets dropped off by him, and they clearly are some kind of like, they're a couple and probably doing all sorts of devious fornications. So he's the son, I think, of the producer. He like has or of Ron Ormond, I think. Is that the guy's name?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So his son gets to be in a bunch of movies, I think. And so that was his part. I believe I got that right. I could be wrong. But I just love that I don't know if she makes the offer or asks him at the very beginning of the film if he'd like to come in. And he says, I'm a lover, not a Christian.
Yeah.
Which I don't know, maybe that has a lot more relevance in the like early 70s about hippie culture or something. But oh man, I thought that's hilarious.
Yeah. It's part of those strange young people.
Strange people coming to churches dressed in mini skirts. So what I think the film really struggles with, I mean, we kind of pointed out earlier, but just this like the paradoxes or the contradictions. And so I just afterwards, I have a really difficult time summing up like what is the point. Like, so I get the like anti-communism. That message is very clear. Communism is bad. And if we don't change, if we don't repent, if we don't keep going to churches, not just on Sunday mornings, but Sunday evenings as well, then the Lord or somehow God is going to allow for communism to take over our country, I think is like the main maybe premise. But what's missing for me, and this is true for all the other, like for both the God is Not Dead movies as well, is this any kind of like positive sense necessarily about what does it mean to be a Christian? I mean, so in this one, they do a much better job of just listing it out, like read your Bible more, pray more, don't watch TV. It's more like there's a clear moral that's given. Mm-hmm. But as far as like what Jesus does in your life, other than turn you away from, these 4 activities and towards these 4 activities, there's not a lot of hope or a lot of sense of, what does it even mean? Or joy, as you were saying, Jeff, or like what is good news, or what is it that we as Christians ought to be doing other than perpetuating the kind of 1950s lifestyle? I mean, you really see that there's this built-in belief in Christendom almost, or that like our nation used to be this, and here we go again, right? With the current political rhetoric is this, we had this beautiful, very godly, we're a Christian nation, something, who knows, fill in the blank with all what that is, leave it to Beaver. And because of drive-in movies, because of the advent of television, whatever it is, the technology was a huge problem in this movie, or came up as a big, like, that's a bad thing. But because of all that, we're about to lose all that. So what we need to do is get rid of everything. Mm-hmm. And that to me is the problem with like evangelicalism in general, is this mode of like, we just need to purify whatever it is. And then we're good, as opposed to any kind of active, here's what it looks like, other than, the actions that will lead to the purification of yourself or other people. There's no sense of what does it look like to actually be a part of the kingdom of God coming, or, the Lord's Prayer, things like that. None of that. You don't get any sense that matters in this world, which is super frustrating.
Yeah.
And ultimately disappointing as a movie that's trying to bring people into, or to repent, or to, to bring, ultimately it seemed like the movie had a built-in altar call, right? It's like, it happens to Judy. And I can imagine if churches showed this in the 70s or whatever, that was, you cut the movie at the end, and then there you go, invite people to come on down and change their life and let God heal them. But to do what? This is the big question mark. For what purpose, other than to continue this kind of nice white American life?
Mm-hmm. Which white, clearly this is taking place in the South. Clearly this is, even the mentioning of the riots and the discontent in society and communism and universities being places where communism is thriving, like that whole concept, those are all the results of the civil rights movement. Like this is, it's not said outright. And even if you were back in 1971 and maybe asked him outright, probably wouldn't say anything. But there was definitely this whitewashing of the entire thing. And not only that, but honestly, the name of Jesus was mentioned more by the communists throughout the film than anything that he said throughout the entire film, except for the end when, it's time to accept Jesus now.
That's a good point.
Well, and the main, it could have just been, this is an old movie, and like the quality of this isn't high def. You're not going to find it in anything more than 160p or something like that. But so I don't know if this was an effect of the coloring or of the, just the grade of the film, but it seems like that the main kind of guy that you see over and over as the communist kind of figurehead is kind of a darker brown, like looking, maybe Italian, I don't know, but had slightly, maybe it's just the clothes too, but I had this impression that he was like a darker person. And, that kind of fits with the, I don't know if it was trying to explicitly be racist, but it just seemed like, like cartoons or whatever, other things that put like, oh, it's a darker colored thing that is the bad thing.
They had that one close-up shot of his face that they used over and over again. And the screen that I was watching on, it looked like they did that on purpose. Like it looked like he was wearing makeup. Like that they borderline blackface, right? Like that, just kind of, like you're saying, making him a little bit darker than maybe he was in real life. And that could have been just the low quality and it was just regular stage makeup, but it certainly was hard not to at least entertain the idea that was happening.
Mm-hmm. Some of like the Westerns at the same time, right? Like it's just like the bad guys are slightly darker, but that's dark is equals bad, light is good. That was clear in there.
You mentioned cartoons, and when he's going through when he's going through the sins of all the things, and then when he gets to the sin of watching too much TV and not reading your Bible, and then he's talking about, look at the cartoons that the kids are watching, and then he lists like crime, sex, and murder, and I'm like, where were those cartoons? Like, I don't remember watching any cartoons with any of that stuff. Maybe sort of murder, but.
Right. But Wile E. Coyote never dies.
Yeah. I want to know what cartoons are in his mind when he's thinking about some of those things.
He always resurrected.
Well, and I love like the montage for that, or the video like documentary of what's happening. It shows like from the vantage point of the TV looking out with like, a kid and his dad with TV trays in front. The kids watching, it seems like a TV, I don't know if it's there or not, but like watching the cartoons and how distracting they are. And he says something to like, how can reading the Bible compete with watching the cartoons or something? Because the dad's like trying to read the Bible in front of a loud TV with his kid all excited, and like looks up and then slowly like closes the Bible and sets it aside. I feel like that role in particular had to have been so fun to play. Like that guy getting to be
gives the son the nudge, like, this is great.
This is better than Leviticus. This is awesome.
Obviously.
Yeah. That was wonderful. And he seemed kind of embarrassed too. Like, he's like,
looking around like,
mom's going to find out. That was the other thing, like, men not going to church. That was kind of highlighted at one point. They're dropping, fathers not dropping off kids and their mom, but not going themselves.
I have to say, though, those 70s church perms were pretty rad.
Yeah, it was very, very 70s. Not as much as A Thief in the Night, if you've ever seen that one.
But I have not. I'll put it on the watch list.
Should check that out. Maybe we'll do that one day on this one after we have some distance between end times movies. Because this is not a rapture movie. Because
that's right.
At the end of this movie, which was different from the ones we see, like Left Behind and all that kind of stuff, you could tell the theology of Reverend Pirkle was, there is no rapture. Like, we're all going to go through this. You're not going to escape the torment. You can only remain faithful through it. So we're definitely dealing with a post-trib conservative Baptist. And then along those lines, like, it's very nationalistic, right? Like his message was, if we don't do this, communists are going to take over and God is going to choose another nation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Why? First of all, why can't God choose many nations? Like, why does it have to be one nation at a time? And especially in regard to the fact that Jesus has come and his whole, mandate of the Great Commission, all the world. But yeah, it was very explicit. Like, it has to be our country, and if we squander this, then it'll be someone like Ethiopia. He mentions all these random
Indonesia,
countries,
or Brazil.
Yeah,
I mean, that is another place where I feel like it's more clear in the movie, but that same mentality exists. I think it's hidden behind more political correctness in evangelical churches today. But that mindset, I mean, the idea of Christendom is still very much, I mean, I don't know if anybody even used that language, but it's still very much, if God, so it ends, the movie ends in some ways with the, is it Second Chronicles? I can't remember the exact passage. Clearly shows that my post-evangelical is showing.
You've watched too many cartoons.
I know I haven't. I can't claim it. But the whole passage of, if my people repent and pray and whatever, call it, I'll heal their land, is the abridged Adam version.
I'd read that.
Yeah. Or, the lawn sign that we still see in some places. But that idea that, God's favor is somehow on America, right? I mean, that's part of our own songs. God shed his grace on thee. So that marrying of the religious expression and experience, and, maybe particular denominations, are definitely the evangelical experience and the religious right, like with patriotism and nationalism. Just like, it's funny in the movie because it's so unfiltered. They're just straight up about it. But I think that same mentality is very strong still now. We just don't talk about it in the same way. Or maybe we've lost the language for it. Or the evangelical world has lost the language for it, or smart enough or savvy enough not to, but still kind of hopes for that. And so, I think, again, that's another strong force, and why you see so many white with less education evangelical folks voting the way that they did, is this hope for that return, that God will show favor on the United States. And if we don't, be better Christians, or, tell everybody that God is not dead, then God's favor is going to move somewhere else, like Indonesia.
Well, any final thoughts before we introduce our rating system?
At the very end of the movie, one of the things that the pastor says to Judy, she basically, it's the classic altar call, asks her, are you, basically something like, are you ready to get your life right with God? For the life of me, I don't know what that means. I think within the church experience, especially within the evangelical world, I think there's a sense of what that is, what that might mean. But this is another way where I feel like films like this and others really trouble me, is even as someone who's come from that, I mean, I guess it would mean, that you would find your place in the kind of Christian culture. But to anybody else on the outside, who wouldn't claim evangelical for them, or even Christianity or anything, it doesn't mean anything. Like, I mean, or it's just so, I don't mean to speak for people, but I just mean to say it's kind of code or whatever. And it feels like it's a way that actually keeps people out. Or exposes that reality to me, which is why I have a really hard time with movies that focus around some kind of altar call or some sort of, what ultimately ends up being an evangelical message, is because it still builds up these walls about who's in and who's out, and offers no real instruction or help for how do you get in without assimilation. Basically, without looking exactly like we do. And if you watch the film, right, unless you're a white 1960s kind of person, you're not really welcome here, or you're a part of the problem. So that's a fun, light note. Sorry.
No, these are final thoughts. What about you, Dylan?
Well, I had one thing that I wanted to bring up that Adam kind of mentioned earlier, is that there's no, which I think we've seen in a lot of all the movies that we've done, there's very little positive reinforcement for what it does look like to live out Christianity, or to, besides, go to church when you're supposed to, or, there's no, I guess, real world or practical advice that people would understand if they weren't already a part of the church, or people would be able to live out if they weren't already involved in this very specific expression of Christianity.
Or even if you are in the church. Like,
Yeah.
so I do all those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah,
Now what?
Absolutely.
What happens when grandma dies? Or what happens, it's like, or, when the farm goes belly up or whatever, there's zero hope. It's just get on, sign your card and get in.
Yeah. I had a question I want to ask you guys. Why do you each of you think that this movie showed up when it did? So what was going on in the collective Christian faith at this time that wanted to get this message out there?
When you started to say you had a question, I was hoping you were going to follow that with, will you come? Will you come? I think he says it 4 times.
That's personal information.
We have candy.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about history. I was thinking, oh man, because communists did kill a bunch of people. There was some I think legitimate fear at the time. I mean, it was definitely blown out of proportion and used politically, but so I don't know a ton of history. I wish I knew specifics more, but it was clear that I think I said this kind of, but just that I think people felt like they were losing the culture that they understood and they knew of people of just being in that normal life for everyone around them meant that, you go to church a couple times and the Bible is central to everything. And you pray and, you don't have sex before you get married and you just be a good little boy and a little girl and you respect your mom and your pa and that's what you do. And when social norms, especially right in the 60s, late into the 60s and 70s start to change and you think, oh man, I heard about, this thing happening on the campus. I mean, we did campus stuff, ministry together, right, Dylan? I remember one of our friends telling us that a parent called her, this is only a couple years ago, asking is it true that people are having sex in the hallways of the dorms or whatever?
Oh my goodness.
Like people still think that. They're coming from that kind of background. And so, right, especially during the kind of free love movement that was going on in the 60s, you see that, and was such a counter or such a, different and such an extreme life experience that was outside of what, the 1950s Leave It to Beaver mindset was, that because of that extremity or whatever, there's this fear. And again, those people, I think, kind of saw themselves as normal and somewhat as the power players or everything was fine. I mean, I think it just goes back to white power or whatever, white supremacy. This is how everything works. And then, that gets threatened a little bit. And the problem is these other people that are acting different and who aren't, why? I mean, it's the ultimate conservative. While I think conservative and, liberal, they need to balance each other out. It was the extreme, the conservative, which was probably felt like the liberal was being really extreme. And so, man, we really need to warn people because, man, it's really easy then to identify these things in the Bible as Jesus is coming back, or if that's not the case, communism is going to destroy us, or I don't know. Just when you had such an easy enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is that moment in history where you could still probably consider us a Christian nation, where there was still a great majority of the people within the nation that went to church or had experience in church, much more so than now. But it's also in the midst of this Cold War. You don't know what's going to happen. You think, literally in schools, they're just coming off of having drills to, for atomic bombs.
Get
and
under
stuff
your
like
desk
that.
if the A-bomb drops.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the precursor to the Jesus movement. So within the 70s, where you had all these people influx into the church because there was just a shift and there was a greater openness for spirituality and stuff like that. So this was kind of almost like a perfect mixture of things that were coming together, where a lot of these movies became effective, effective to the point that even in the 90s, they were still showing movies like this, and it still influenced a whole another influx with the Left Behind series about using this tactic of the world is coming to an end, things are getting worse. And it's kind of hard not to believe that when you go from Hitler to the Cold War into the 90s and, and then now into the terrorism that we're seeing today, and ignore, actual statistics about how crime and all that is going down, but you just go off the feeling of what's being put out there in the news. So it's this perfect mixture, and I think that this movie in particular, I came from a Pentecostal background, so the last half of this movie I really related to, because how he's going. The first half of the movie is his sermon telling everything that's going to happen, intercut by hypothetical scenarios with the communists. But then the last part is the woman responding to words that she's hearing from the pulpit and flashing to moments that relate to it. And that was me in youth group growing up. Like I would hear that message and I'd be like, literally, like it visualized the very thing that I was doing in my mind. I was like, oh, I did that. And I was going to situations that I felt guilty about that led me to essentially cry out like she did in the end and come to many and many altar calls and let that guilt, which put me in the place that we've talked about before with these movies, is it put me in the place of not really knowing where to go except for enter into a cycle of doing something bad, feeling guilty, going to an altar, doing something bad. And that felt like what the Christian life was, because there was nothing after that. And these movies kind of heighten that. The theology behind these movies heighten that. It's more about fear and what's going to happen if you don't, as opposed to what to do. And it's especially disconcerting because it's coming off of the civil rights movement, like the very embodiment of what we're supposed to do with this good news, and almost reacting against it.
Are we going to watch more apocalyptic style movies? Like, do we need to group these somehow, or
I think we need to space them out. Yeah. I think we'll get apocalyptic.
Yeah, it might get
out. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll wait.
That's a good idea.
Because eventually, I feel like we have to do the Nicolas Cage Left Behind.
Oh, for sure.
Because if we're going to be talking about movies and we don't do one with Nicolas Cage, I'm just going to feel like we've robbed people.
Yeah. We're really just wasting our time if we don't do that.
Exactly. But we have a great movie next month, and then we'll plan out some other stuff, and we'll talk about that at the end of the show. So we've come up with a rating system. So the premise of this conversation that we're having is these movies representing Christianity on some level. So we decided, instead of like 5-star review or some other ones that we threw out there, we are going to do a scale of 1 to 30 silver pieces. 30 silver pieces being this movie is completely sold out the gospel, and it is the antithesis of everything it stands for. 1 piece of silver being, actually this is pretty good and in line with the gospel itself. So this is our unique review system. So tell me, gentlemen, how many pieces of silver does this film get for you?
Oh, man.
I can go first. I'm going to say 27. And the reason it's not a full 30 is because I am unsure about whether or not his actual claimed events that have happened did actually happen in other communist countries. So I'll give that the benefit of the doubt.
So for the possibility of truth in there.
Yeah.
The unfair is because you can't, it's not unverifiable.
That's fair.
Right?
That's fair.
I don't know. I can't say it.
I'm too much of a generous person, I guess you could say, to go the full 30 for that reason.
Oh man. Okay. So I feel like all rating systems, I kind of adjust as I go. But I was going to say something like 20 because, I'm torn between like in some way, this is extremely accurate in its portrayal, right, of what evangelical folks, like I really think you could show this in today's, some evangelical churches, and they might think, okay, it's a little campy, or hopefully they would think that, but they might say, yeah, that's the message. The gospel was preached at the end, and there is a response that's required and asked the people. But as far as like, how the why it's there and not at 10 or something is because I feel like it just misses like there's nothing about what is the good news other than Jesus saves you from commies, I guess. I'll say 20. And I think it's fairly accurate. And I mean, especially like you're saying, Jeff, the Christianity that I grew up with wouldn't have had that much of a different message. Yeah.
I'm gonna, those are kind of the same reasons that you guys are going. I'm not going to go the full 30, although I'm tempted, but I feel like I'm going to save the 1 and the 30 for those special gems that come along. And I think that this just misses that criteria, only because, Adam, what you were saying is that there's a lot that I remember, like, this was my Christianity for a long time. And I think that there is some truth to being aware of how things may be rising. And although, maybe the three of us being more left-leaning Christians wouldn't necessarily feel that way in regards to communism or something like that, but we certainly probably all, at least a tinge, feel that way about the current direction of our political future in America, that we do have some red flags popping up. So I do think that that's part of our responsibility as Christians, is to be aware of the world around us and combat danger in some way. So even though we don't agree with what is dangerous, I still relate with that. And then it was weird. It was weird watching those movies and feeling like, man, I'm back in youth group and I'm having this. I almost like got up from my chair and like went to the TV and kneeled down or something.
The altar.
So I'm gonna go with 25 pieces of silver because it is genuinely still an awful movie that uses that's message is completely antithetical to the method and the genre of film that it's choosing to express that message in, which bothers me to no end. So. And fear conversion is the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
So I'm going with 25. So I think we're
25.
Do it for your dead mother.
I know, right?
Oh man, not for your own like salvation.
Yeah.
I feel like there should have been like an end credit scene where everyone's in heaven just throwing up candy.
Yeah. Jesus came through.
Yeah.
Jesus does give us candy, and all right. Anyway,
Smarties.
So do you recommend this movie? Like when we say recommendation, we're saying like it's worth checking out because for the most part, the movies we're going to be looking at, I think there are going to be some exceptions along the way, but for the most part, the films that we're going to be looking at really are not ones that we would recommend as far as like if you want to watch a good movie. If you have a propensity towards watching bad movies and enjoying them and having some enjoyment from those, then that's what we mean by recommend, that it's worth checking out. So what do you two think? Is this worth, do you give this your thumbs up, your recommendation to go see it?
I'm going to say absolutely. Thumbs up. It's a great example of propaganda films and the exploitation, like that whole genre, like you see. I mean, it's, I agree with your assessment that it's a paradox that like contradicts itself, but it's like, it's different, right? Than, I mean, you don't sit down and watch this kind of movie. So if anybody that's like interested in the kind of different ways movies and narrative has been told, this is great. It's like, yeah, this is what what a movie is like back then. Not all movies, not at all, but I mean like this kind of movie. And also to see like the extreme of which, to be able to compare with modern Christian movies, to see like, you haven't come that far sometimes. I'm all for it. Thumbs up.
I'd say probably with the caveat or the asterisk that if you maybe if you grew up in a setting like yours, Jeff, it might have some triggers in it for you. So, but yeah, if you want to check out something that is truly a work, not of art, but just it's a work, then yeah, go see this movie. It'll be a good 45 minutes.
I would say the same thing with the caveat also that if you don't like horror B movie exploitation films, then don't watch it because you're not going to like it. Like
that's true.
If you don't like gore, you don't like that kind of stuff, don't go watch it because it's not worth it because it's not going to be something you're interested in. But if you like that kind of film, it should be at the top of your list to go see because it is everything that genre of film should be, and then also shouldn't be in any way, shape, or form. And as far as like recommendations, if you're not going to see this, what films you should see? Again, I would say if you like exploitation films, a good modern example of that would be Quentin Tarantino's homage to this type of film, Grindhouse, where he in one movie he does a double feature and kind of mimics why people went to go see these movies and the scenarios and places they went to go see them in the first place. His work is very influenced by this genre of film. Also, the original Dawn of the Dead, great movie. And then pretty much any of the blaxploitation films from the 70s are fantastic. There's one called The Mac with Richard Pryor that is one of his first films that is very really really good. If you like that genre. If you don't like that genre, none of this is worth checking out. What about other films you guys recommend along these lines?
If you were looking for a really good apocalyptic movie, I would say go see Children of Men. It is a wonderful
good one.
Post-apocalyptic movie where humanity is stopped being able to have children. And the lead actor is Clive Owen, and he plays someone who has lost all hope in the world and political system. And then there's a turn of events that kind of brings him back into the political struggle, you could say. So that's all I'll say. Definitely one of my favorite movies. It's directed by Alfonso Cuarón, who is one of my favorite directors, and it's just beautifully shot and so well done.
The movie I would recommend, it only makes sense if you do watch this movie. So it's like the to get the perspective of the other side, I would say, watch the movie that I referenced earlier, The Battleship Potemkin. It was a movie that was commissioned by Stalin that shows basically that it's to like highlight the greatness of communism. There's no single character. The way the movie is shot as a propaganda film shows unity. It shows like community. It's like it's all focused on a bunch of people, basically the power of the state. And then there's a great scene of which other movies have later copied. So if you like, I think it's Goodfellas. There's a scene where like this baby carriage is going down these
Untouchables.
Untouchables. Mm-hmm. There you go. Mm-hmm. That's copied from the movie. It's an homage to the Battleship Potemkin. There's a scene called The Stairs of Odessa where that same kind of scene happens. And you'll get like even the style is very similar. But I almost feel like if this was the movie that's playing in like churches in America, the Battleship Potemkin movie is the one that's playing, in the streets or whatever of Russia and other places.
Yeah.
All right. Did either of you find any kind of review or second opinion on this particular film? This is a tough one because it's pretty much only on YouTube. I found one review. So this is where we like to get a second opinion. Let's call this a redeemed perspective.
There you go.
And we got to stick with the the religious imagery for our segments. But I couldn't find anything because obviously this isn't something that is on Amazon that you can buy. It's probably out of print, which is why the only place we can find it on YouTube. But I found random blogs, and this one person said, so this isn't a redeemed perspective. This has come more along the lines of where we're at. This person said, a 1971 piece of propaganda that has the audacity to claim that 60 years ago there were no communists. However, consider the following events that happened before 1911. Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. The first International Communist Party was 1864, Paris Commune founded in 1871, and the Russian Revolution, which was in 1905. So I know the Russian Revolution is accurate. I'm loose on the other dates, but it sounds right. So, and then someone on IMDb wrote a quick little review. They gave it 3 out of 10 stars. And they said, this movie was one that all our local churches gathered for a viewing when it first came out. I remember screaming and hiding my face in Daddy's shirt. It was the single most terrifying movie I had watched as a child. Horror movies viewed as a teen never left such an impression on me as this movie did. It is not such a scary show now in this day and age, but at the time, it was not a movie for a child to see. My parents, and this is the best part, my parents have always apologized when this movie has been brought up in conversation. So please keep in mind that while this movie is okay for older children and up, which not older children, no children should watch this movie. It's not appropriate for children who have yet learned the difference between what's real and what's not, which is a ridiculous statement because this movie is proposing that all of this is real.
Yeah, already
it is.
Anyway.
Okay, I have one, two things. One was a YouTube review. This person says, the decapitation scene woke me up. I think this movie has given me brain cancer. And then somebody else claiming, and I didn't double check this, it could be that he says Ron Ormond's fake accent is so poorly done that I genuinely can't tell if his character is supposed to be Russian or Cuban. So I don't know. Is the main guy Ron Ormond himself? That could be. I mean, the main communist guy.
Oh.
This person could have not noticed. And now that you say it, I can kind of, or now that this person says it, I can kind of feel like I could see that, like an actor trying to go between like Russian half the time and then their, distorted version of what they imagine a Cuban accent to be would make sense for what happened to the vocal gymnastics going on. But
well, he was. I'm looking at his IMDb right now. And he was accredited as an actor in Footmen Tire What Will Horses Do. So
I wonder if that's him.
Yeah.
I don't know how this person knows, but that's pretty cool.
Well, there's a lot on this guy because there's a lot of the reason I even found out about this movie in the first place is because I was reading a book on film subgenres and exploitation films and stuff. And it had a whole chapter on Christian exploitation films. And it largely centered around this movie. And I had always thought that The Thief in the Night was the first like major end times movie. And when I stumbled across this gem, I was pleasantly surprised.
Nice.
I think my favorite YouTube comment would be a Drive-in theaters were the Netflix and chill of the 20th century.
That's fantastic. Well said. All right, well, I think that is going to do it this time for our Divine SINema review. We will be back next week with our regular Irenicast episodes, and at the very last episode of this year, we will return with Divine SINema, and we will be going over Kirk Cameron's Saving Christmas. We gotta keep it holiday themed, so we'll have a
Christmas theme, Jeff. We're saving Christmas, not the holidays.
Sorry. We're going for a Christmas theme, not a holiday theme. I am in error, and I apologize. There's no candy for me tonight. So we will be going over that movie. Join us for that. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be interesting. And yeah, so we will continue doing this. Give us your feedback. Let us know. We've already gotten a couple suggestions from listeners for future movies. So we did get a suggestion from Emily, who suggested Christian Mingle, which we all found out that there's a Christian Mingle movie. Yeah. So look forward to that in the pretty immediate future, sometime after Saving Christmas, and send us your requests. And we will also look at some movies that could be considered Christian that are actually good films. We won't always concentrate on that, but there are things that deserve criticism, and some of these clearly do.
Particular people,
right? So our intent is not to be mean, but our intent is to be critical, which we all need. So for this edition of Divine SINema, I'm Jeff.
I'm Adam.
And I am Dylan.
See you next time.